Yaldabaoth, a psychological interpretation of the ego and human consciousness. The figure of Yaldabaoth in Gnostic literature serves as a profound metaphor for the development of human consciousness and the ego. Rather than interpreting Yaldabaoth as a literal demiurge, a psychological approach reveals that this figure represents the outward senses, ignorance, and the narcissistic self that defines human psychological existence. By analyzing scriptural references and symbolic language, we can understand Yaldabaoth as an archetype within human consciousness that governs perception, self-identity, and opposition to divine knowledge. The origin of Yaldabaoth, a symbol of ignorance and ego. Gnostic texts describe Yaldabaoth as the product of Pistis Sophia's error, a being formed in ignorance, lacking spirit, yet wielding authority over matter. The Apocryphon of John states, "And when she saw the consequences of her desire, it changed into a form of a lion-faced serpent. And its eyes were like lightning fires which flash. She cast it away from her, outside that place, that no one of the immortal ones might see it, for she had created it in ignorance." Apocryphon of John. Similarly, On the Origin of the World describes Yaldabaoth's emergence from the waters, reinforcing his association with chaos and unformed thought. There appeared for the first time a ruler, out of the waters, lion-like in appearance, androgynous, having great authority within him, and ignorant of whence he had come into being. On the Origin of the World. The motif of Yaldabaoth arising from the waters is significant. In ancient symbolism, water represents unformed thought, chaos, and instability. Genesis 1 verse 10 refers to the seas as the undefined and undirected state of mind. The phrase, "out of the waters," suggests a consciousness not yet disciplined by divine wisdom, a mind ruled by impulses and external perceptions. Just as the sea represents doubt in Mark 6:47-51, Yaldabaoth signifies the uncertain, wavering nature of the ego before it is tamed by divine knowledge. Yaldabaoth as the rational ruler of the unawakened mind. The Gnostics understood Yaldabaoth as the dominator of the material world, which is characterized by sensory perception and ignorance. Origen, in Contra Celsum, refers to him as, "O Yaldabaoth, who art the rational ruler of a pure mind." Contra Celsum. This statement reframes Yaldabaoth's role, not as a chaotic force of the senses, but as a structured rational power governing a mind that is yet unawakened to divine truth. Psychologically, Yaldabaoth represents the intellect bound by its own logic, confident in its own reasoning, yet still disconnected from spiritual understanding. The ego, in its early development, seeks order and control, believing itself to be autonomous. However, without the illumination of divine wisdom, even a pure mind remains trapped within the limitations of its own construct, mistaking its rationality for ultimate truth. Yaldabaoth's ignorance is emphasized in On the Origin of the World. Now, as for the ruler Yaldabaoth, he is ignorant of the force of Pistis. He did not see her face. Rather, he saw in the water the likeness that spoke with him. On the Origin of the World. Here, Pistis Sophia, faith and wisdom, withdraws, and Yaldabaoth is left ruling over matter with only a distorted reflection of reality. This ignorance mirrors the psychological process where the ego, initially unaware of its dependence on higher consciousness, operates under the illusion of autonomy. The lion-faced serpent, symbolism of desire and pride. Yaldabaoth is depicted as a lion-faced serpent, an image rich with symbolic meaning. The lion represents aggression, power, and egoic domination, while the serpent is a universal symbol of desire and deception. In biblical texts, both lions and serpents symbolize wicked rulers, false prophets, and destructive forces. Psalm 10:9, "He lieth in wait secretly as a lion in his den. He lieth in wait to catch the poor." Ezekiel 22 verse 1, "There is a conspiracy of her prophets in the midst thereof, like a roaring lion ravening the prey." 1 Peter 5:8, "Your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour." Similarly, the serpent in Genesis and the fiery serpents in Numbers 21 represent desire, deception, and uncontrolled impulses. Yaldabaoth, as a lion-faced serpent, embodies the ego-driven self that is consumed by pride, sensory perception, and the illusion of power. The beast from the sea, Yaldabaoth in biblical imagery. Yaldabaoth's emergence from the waters and On the Origin of the World parallels the imagery of the beast in Revelation. "And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. Revelation 13:1. The sea, as discussed earlier, represents an unstable and unformed state of consciousness. The beast, like Yaldabaoth, derives its authority from the chaotic, unrefined elements of human nature, impulses, desires, and egotistical rule. Likewise, Daniel's vision of beasts rising from the sea, Daniel 7:4, symbolizes oppressive worldly powers, reinforcing Yaldabaoth's function as the archetypal ruler of the carnal mind. His domain is not merely external, but is also an internal reality. He is the force that sustains egoic illusions and prevents spiritual awakening. Yaldabaoth as the shadow of ego development. The development of an individual ego is a necessary stage in human consciousness, but when the ego is unchecked, it becomes a force of ignorance, self-deception, and opposition to divine knowledge. Yaldabaoth represents this unrefined ego, which, though powerful, remains blind to its origins. Since that day, there appeared the principle of verbal expression, which reached the gods and the angels and mankind. And what came into being as a result of verbal expression, the gods and the angels and mankind finished. On the origin of the world. This suggests that Yaldabaoth is the result of speech, an externalized expression of thought, a projection of consciousness that takes on an independent identity. In psychological terms, this reflects the moment when self-awareness shifts from being a passive reflection of divine wisdom to an autonomous, ego-driven force. Conclusion: Yaldabaoth as a psychological construct. Understanding Yaldabaoth through a psychological lens allows us to see him not as a literal being, but as a personification of the carnal mind. He is the shadow side of human development, the necessary but dangerous phase of ego formation that must ultimately be transcended. Just as Pistis Sophia withdrew from Yaldabaoth, the path to divine wisdom requires overcoming the illusions of the ego and realigning the mind with divine reality. By recognizing Yaldabaoth's presence in our own consciousness, our attachment to material perception, our self-importance, our ignorance of divine truth, we take the first step in overcoming the dominion of the outward senses and moving towards spiritual enlightenment. In this sense, Yaldabaoth is not an external adversary, but an internal condition to be understood, integrated, and ultimately transcended.